Let me tell you what we're doing. We are doing a documentary on the history of the Thompson Orphanage. From its establishment in 1886, directly out of St. Peter's Episcopal Church,
Yes, it was.
down until really today with the Thompson operation as it exists today, which is still going. But of course it's, as you know, changed substantially in focus and purpose.
What is it doing now? Is it a foundation?
It's called Thompson Child and Family Focus.
Okay.
And like so many, quote, orphanage institutions, you've had this very strong constriction to where it deals primarily with children who have serious
Is it residential?
abuse problems. Because they get their funding primarily from Medicaid, and Medicaid wants them to get into foster homes because it's cheaper, or to go back with their families. They do have some residential children for like 12 to 15
Is it still in the same location? Or have they?
It's out at their satellite farm
Okay.
that Manley Wisnett got out on Margaret Wallace Road, so they are there.
What's on the old property?
The old property is now, the only building that's left is the chapel, the St. Mary's Chapel, and it is a public park.
Yeah. Well, that's
So
good. That's a good use. That chapel's where Dana was married, Chrissy.
Oh, okay.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Really?
my niece.
Is that right? Is that right?
Yeah.
First of all, your life story is incredible, and I don't need to say to you what I'm sure thousands have said. I really do admire your courage. I mean,
Thank you.
I mean,
I don't
truly,
know that that's what it is,
True.
but I appreciate
Well,
that. Might be foolhardiness.
I'm going to focus very specifically on the Thompson Orphanage involvement in your life. And where I'd like to start out is that when you were a choir member and a youth leader and an acolyte at St. Peter's Episcopal Church, before you graduated from high school, to what extent were you aware of the existence of Thompson Orphanage, and what, if any, interaction did you have with the Wisnets? And also, I believe Reverend Wheeler was still the chaplain at that time. Before we get into the later period, to what extent were you aware of it?
Well, I think everybody in Charlotte who was an Episcopalian was aware of Thompson Orphanage, and maybe particularly those of us at St. Peter's, because of the historic connection. It was sort of a crown jewel. It was one of the things for which our church was the proudest. And the Wisnets, I don't remember when I met the Wisnets. I don't recall meeting them when I was at St. Peter's, but I could have. I know at Central we had classmates who were Thompson Orphanage residents, and so I got an image of the orphanage from talking to people who were my classmates. And I'm sure I went there a time or two, but I can't remember anything specifically about it. But it was unknown in a real sense, because that highway had not been cut through the farmland, and so people didn't know that this gorgeous piece of property was right there in the heart of Charlotte. There's Independence Boulevard, is that the road?
Yes.
It was cut through it. That opened people's eyes to something they never really knew. They saw the sort of dull brick buildings of the Thompson Orphanage. They had no idea of the expanse behind it. So that was the kind of eye-opening when Independence Boulevard was cut through there.
You said that while you were at Central, and I did look at your 1949 annual, by the way, that you gained an image of the orphanage from the fact that there were classmates there who came from the orphanage. What was that image that you gained of the orphanage?
Well, it's hard to remember, to be honest. It's a long time ago. And it's hard to separate values that I hold today from the values I would have held then. My image was that they were treated fairly strictly, and I don't mean anything negative about that, but there were lots of rules that they had to conform to, and Mr. and Mrs. Wisnett were sort of parents, in effect, to a great big wide variety, and they would talk about the discipline problems that they had, and the rules they had for study and the rules they had for work and that sort of thing. But I don't remember anything specific about that.
Well, let's move to really the kind of heart of the issue. And this is when 1958, 1959, when you are appointed to the State of the Diocese Committee, and in a sense, because of circumstance, a greater responsibility devolved onto you for the function of that committee. And as I sort of gained from, I think, from your autobiography, in many instances in the past, the presentation of these reports had been somewhat perfunctory. They hadn't been really seriously a serious matter. But you obviously went through a process of evaluating two institutions in Charlotte. Obviously, one of them was Good Samaritan Hospital. The other was Thompson Orphanage. And I'm very interested in several aspects of that. First of all, what was your methodology? How did you become more knowledgeable about the operations of the orphanage when it appears that you had been before? What was the nature of your interaction with the administration of the orphanage, specifically Manley and Pearl Wisnett? And then what basically was the assessment of the operation of the orphanage that you came up to as a result of that process?
Well, again, you're asking me to recall things that I haven't thought about in well over 50 years, so I don't know what the details are. I remember the thing that sort of amazed me was that I was maybe 3 years out of seminary and was the junior clergy member of this committee. And the senior member, and I can't even remember who that was now, either moved out of the diocese or something, and so I was the senior priest left, but I was a real rookie. And normally in that set of circumstances, the bishop would have appointed another senior priest to chair this committee, and he didn't, and why he didn't, I don't know. My guess is it didn't even occur to him. But my fantasies would like to make me think that he knew me well enough to think I could handle that responsibility. I'd been pretty active in the diocese as a teenager and as a young person, and I knew Bishop Peeney quite well and admired him a great deal. The committee had very few members, and I can't even remember who they were, but maybe 3 or 4 people altogether. And our charge was to evaluate the state of the diocese. And that could have gone in any direction for reasons that I'm not sure why we did it. We decided to focus on some institutions. I suspect the Good Samaritan Hospital was the impetus for that. This was in the days of segregation, and generally speaking, even at public hospitals, black patients were not accommodated, or if they were accommodated, they were not welcomed. And Good Samaritan Hospital was, at least so far as I knew, the only hospital specifically for the medical care of black citizens of the city of Charlotte. And it was not a very good hospital. I remember reading some statistics about the death rate, and I'm not sure you can tell much about a hospital by reading the death rate until you know and understand what kind of clientele they're serving. Is it an elderly clientele or whatever? But it struck me as way outside the bounds, that it was not really good medical care. And racism, I was sort of newly awakened to what racism had done at that point in my life. I'd gone to school with my first black student at seminary. I went through schools in Charlotte totally segregated. University of North Carolina was totally segregated. They might have had a couple of black students in the graduate department, but I never saw them. They certainly didn't have in the undergraduate. Even girls couldn't come to the University of North Carolina until they were in their 3rd year of college, so that junior colleges sort of fed the university. But the racism that was I was newly feeling, and the guilt of the racist past of my country and my region particularly, I was very alive to that, and I think probably the investigation of the Black Hospital was the trigger. Probably Thompson Orphanage followed that. We were dealing with institutions, but it was the passion at that point was about Good Samaritan Hospital. And although it didn't get closed because of my report, I hope it did sort of move things along so that what was then called Charlotte Memorial Hospital, which at one point had been St. Peter's Hospital, went into Charlotte Memorial, and so the Episcopal Church had a role to play and had a respect because we helped bring Charlotte Memorial Hospital into being. And I think when the charter was actually drawn, and I'm not sure of this fact, but I remember being told that part of the reason when St. Peter's transferred all of its assets into Charlotte Memorial, that the board agreed that the board of trustees of the hospital will always have a majority of Episcopalians. I think that might have been the case for 1 year, and after everybody sort of forgot about it. And that's okay. I don't think the church exists to perpetuate itself, but to serve the needs that it's set up to serve. And an Episcopal board doesn't necessarily help that to happen. But anyway, we did get to the place where black patients were treated at the heretofore white hospitals. And Thompson Orphanage came into the debate for two reasons. One is that I'd been doing some reading on child care, and the image of the residential orphanage was not held in very high respect at that time. Foster home care was thought of as a step forward, and this orphanage was sort of locked into the pattern of the past. And I think Mr. and Mrs. Wilson were very fine people. But I think that their image of the hospital was what they were familiar with. I mean, of the orphanage was what they were familiar with. And I have a hard time thinking for them now because I assume they're both deceased. I didn't know them well enough to know that when they had died, for example. I think they were caring people, and I think they took their responsibilities, but I think they were dated in their approach. And it was almost an accident, it seems to me, that the more we investigated it, the more it seemed that the focus of that institution was not so much on the children as it was on the farm. That is, the farm didn't exist to assist the children sort of existed to help the farm be run. It looked to me like the focus was out. And that was the first clue. And then we began to investigate the farming procedures, dairy farming procedures. And I remember being in touch with North Carolina State College, as it was called then, NC State University now, to get some ideas about what constitutes the proper way to run a dairy and what constitutes the investment per cow if you're going to run a profitable institution. And the figures at Thompson Orphanage that we received back when we compared them were all out of kilter. And that is, the cows were very expensive cows. And they paved enough of that area so the cows didn't have to walk in the mud. So that we likened it to the air base at Douglas Field. You know, it just had a lot of pavement. And the focus seemed backwards to me and to the committee. And as I say, I can't even remember now who the other members of the committee were. And so we began to investigate it, and we made some contacts with the Wisnets, and again, I don't remember any of and asked some questions. It didn't occur to me that was I had to do more than that. And we framed this report. Now, when I was the bishop, I don't think I would have allowed a report to come to the floor of my convention if I hadn't received it and read it beforehand. But Bishop Enoch never did that, and so we printed our report out and handed it out at the convention. And that's the first time the bishop saw it. It's the first time I suspect Red Wisnet saw it. And he immediately responded, as I recall, on the floor and began to explain these things. And what they finally did, and what the resolution of it was that it was commended, I think, and again, you'd have to check the records, but I think that the resolution was to commend it to the Executive Council of the Diocese for further investigation or something like it. It wasn't a fait accompli. But as they investigated, I think our insights held up pretty well. And it was not long before the institution, at least as it had previously existed, was closed. And I don't remember how long the Wisnet stayed after that. You'd have to refresh my memory on that.
1965.
So it was about 7 years longer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember when Good Samaritan Hospital closed either. All I think we accomplished is that we raised sufficient questions so that the process would would continue to investigate both of those institutions. And I hope the right decision was made in both cases. When I lived in Tarboro some years later, we again had a black hospital and a white hospital. And the black hospital was run by a black doctor, it was even owned by the black doctor. His name was Dr. Quigless, and I was a very good friend of his, and his wife. He didn't come to our church, but his wife and his children did. And again, I could see the difference in medical care for black people and for white people. And it was just appalling to me that, and Dr. Quigless is not an evil man or a bad man or even a bad doctor, but his equipment was so secondary to what the white people had, and it was a shoestring operation because economic power hardly existed in the black community. The best paid black people in that community you could name on a hand, and that'd be your school principal and your high school teachers and the county farm agent and Dr. Quigless and a black dentist named Moses Ray. But outside of that, the only jobs that black people had in that little town were domestic service and yard men or handyman work or driving a truck and doing what you can do with a truck for your income. So the disparity between black and white was just a huge issue in my mind, a moral issue of conscience about how these people were treated.
Do you look back on your involvement with an examination of the Thompson Orphanage, which clearly set into motion a process certainly not limited to Thompson Orphanage? It was going on broadly across the country. But do you look back on that as something that was significant in your career?
Well, when I was writing the autobiography, I couldn't remember the year. And so I contacted the people at the diocese and had them search it out for me. I thought it was actually earlier. I thought it was even younger. I remember being terribly young. I think I was ordained when I was 24 years old, and so that would have been maybe 28. And brash and arrogant might not be quite the right word, but I was smarter then than I've ever been before. We could say it that way. I was filled with the potential of things I could accomplish as a priest in the church, and very much a church romantic at that point in my life. And I felt an intimate connection with the Diocese of North Carolina. That had been my sort of spiritual home. I'd been president of the young people of the diocese. In that capacity, I'd gone all over the diocese speaking to youth groups, and I knew the clergy, and I went to the diocesan camp, and it was a kind of extended family for me, and I still feel a very close kinship with it. And I'm delighted that I've lived long enough to see that diocese elect a man like Michael Curry to be their new bishop. See, when I was a child, if a black person had come to the church I was worshiping in to worship, they probably would have been arrested and hauled off by the police. And to go from that to the place where an African American can be elected by the people of North Carolina to be their bishop, and a very gifted African American, I must say. Michael is a very competent man. That gives me such hope that the church can be an agent for change. And I see the same thing when I look at the way women were treated. We called the women in my church when I was a child the auxiliary. They were not allowed to sit on the vestry or to participate in worship or to be on any decision-making council at any level in the life of the church, whether it was parish or diocese or the national church. And today, more than 50% of our clergy are women, and the presiding bishop of my church is a woman, a good friend, and a very gifted woman. And we've got about 20 women bishops in our church today. And I'm just really incredibly proud that a church can engage the issues and create sufficient change to keep up with the times. It makes me a very proud person.
And I sort of got, and I want to, well, let me go to this. Talking about child welfare and child protection, you can talk, one can talk to professionals, and I don't claim to be a professional by any means whatsoever in child welfare and child protection. But you can go to them, even serious professionals, and they will say there are serious issues with the foster care system. The philosophy is that the most important principle is family preservation and family reunification. Therefore, if parental rights are terminated and a child is put into foster care, there are basically two ways that that child can get out of that foster care system. Either by being reunited with their family, which in some cases is simply not possible, or they are adopted out of the foster care system. Well, the problem is that many of these children never get out of foster care. Unfortunately, seeing that things have not progressed as well as we might, minority children, for example, there are not enough foster care families who want to have a minority child.
Yep, I understand that.
So they stay in this system, frequently moving from family to family to family to family up until they're 18 years old. And if a child gets to be 8 or 9 years old, nobody's going to adopt them. Everybody wants to adopt a baby, preferably a white baby. So there are people that will say that among the menu items that should be available in the child care system, child welfare system, and protection system are orphanages. Now, obviously, those are orphanages that need to be well run. They need to have, but what, for instance, when the Republicans took control of the House in 1994 in Newt Gingrich's contract with America, he came out saying essentially that there should be an opportunity, if federal money is going to be used for child welfare, that among the options that should be available are orphanages. Well, he was absolutely blasted from the left. Well,
We want to go back to Charles Dickens.
Oliver Twist. Now, what is your reaction to that criticism that is labeled at foster care and the feeling that the Thompson orphanage, there are some people that will say the Thompson orphanages of the world were far better. There are some who will say, including a lot of the alumni, which is not surprising, that will say the Thompson orphanage was actually preferable. What would be your reaction?
I'd be glad to hear that. An orphanage well run by loving people can be a very comfortable environment for kids to grow up in. Just like I think a dictatorship is the best form of government if you've got the perfect dictator who's totally unself-centered and totally willing to do what's right for the people. Democracy is terribly inconvenient sometimes because it takes so long to make a decision. But I'd much rather have a democracy because given the nature of human life, I think a majority governing the minority and the possibility that there always can be change back and forth as to who's the majority and who's the minority is the best possible form of government. But if I could have the perfect king or the perfect dictator, or if God could be the president, then I'd say let's do it the simplest way that we can do it. I don't have any objection to orphanages. When I was in college at the University of North Carolina, my roommate David Woodruff was a child who'd come through the Oxford orphanage in Oxford, North Carolina. His father had died and his mother had gotten a job as a house mother. So he moved in and lived in the orphanage, and that's the way he survived. And his sisters did too, their whole family moved in. And David was an absolutely wonderful human being, later became a priest, and still alive so far as I know, living somewhere in southwestern Virginia. And he would tell you that it was a life-changing and life-enhancing experience for him. When I was 12 years old, I became a half-orphan, that is, my father died. And my mother, who had not finished the 9th grade in school, had no marketable skills, and my father's death, after following a long sickness and a period of unemployment, when he was buried, there was no resource left. in the family. So it was a real struggle, and I remember feeling that I wasn't very far from being a candidate for a place like the Thompson Orphanage. So I suspect I had some personal feelings about that. But I don't object to a well-run orphanage being one among the assets of child care, though I think I would prefer a different option than a big group situation. But I don't have any expertise on that particularly. I don't have any objection.
I've talked to several alumni of Thompson Orphanage. I've interviewed several alumni of Thompson Orphanage. Now, obviously, this is in no sense a scientific sample.
I understand.
These tend to be people who are active in the Thompson Alumni Organization. So let me say that straight up front. They are very, very defensive of the orphanage, of Thompson Orphanage. I mean, they think that it was wonderful. Their image of the cows. It seems to me that there were three principal ideas that undergirded the Thompson Orphanage operation under the Wisnets. One was grounding in traditional Episcopal church going. They went to St. Martin's, they went to St. Peter's, they went to St. Mary's, and Wheeler preached, and they took communion, you know, all that.
Where
all
was
that
St.
stuff.
Mary's?
St. Mary's was the chapel at the orphanage.
At the orphanage, okay.
orphanage.
Well, I knew Mr. Wheeler very well because he was the assistant at St. Peter's.
What kind of a man was he?
He was in my opinion, this is a child talking about a person. He was a very godly, quiet, responsible man. He was the priest that married my sister. And I don't remember him as a big personality. I remember him as always sort of fitting in. He was sort of a chronic assistant, but he was kind and gentle and loving. That was the image I had of him anyway. I remember him serving a little church out in the northern part of Charlotte called Chapel of Hope. It's changed its name, and I don't know what it's called now. But it was a community. It was a mill community, and the children there were out of the mill family community, and it was a pretty poor environment. And I can remember and he was in charge of that, and I can remember a number of Sunday nights, at every Sunday night service, I'd go out there, sometimes with him, and participate in that worship service. But I don't have any big impression of him, but I certainly have nothing but a pleasant impression of him.
The second principle was an idle mind is a devil's playground.
Yeah.
And in fact, I had people who said that was really what the cows were all about. It was to get the kids up in the morning, go down and milk the cows, do. Girls had specific responsibilities. So you need to be busy, need to be active, activities. Give them chores to do. They'd come home from school, they'd do chores. What's your reaction to that idea that an idle mind is the devil's playground?
Well, I don't know that I would buy into that very deeply. But it wouldn't bother me. What would bother me is that if the farm was the priority and the children were secondary, and I do think the priority makes a difference. There are a lot of homes that run on this model around the country. And there are a lot of boys' town places where the chores are a terribly big, important piece of that. Some of them are dreadful, I must say, and some of them are a little more than places where young boys are abused. But I never felt anything about that. I don't think anybody ever questioned Red Wisnett and his wife having any ulterior motives except the care and welfare of those children. If they had any limitation, I think it would be the limitation of their vision and not a limitation of character or of a desire to be helpful.
In your autobiography, I believe it's in your autobiography that you say that they were stuck in the 19th century.
Yeah, I could have said that. That's the sort of thing.
What did you mean? What did you mean?
Well, I'm sure I have no idea at this point, but when you're 25, 26, 27 years old, you're much brasher than you are later. And you're quite sure that anything that's old-fashioned is antiquated. And I guess if I had to put some content into that, it would be that that the things I was reading about child care did not hold a big orphanage in high respect, a big group home in high respect, and that if you can do it, if there's no other way to raise children, I want children to be cared for. But if there are better ways, and even smaller, if you could keep families together, if a foster home could be for all of the children of a family so the children could at least stay together, I would think that would be a preferable. There were families in the Thompson orphanage, and they were sort of separated in their different dormitories or houses because they were different ages or different sexes, so that even the children didn't get to give each other the kind of mutual support I think children are capable of giving when there's a parentless situation.
Going back to your autobiography, I assume that even though your mother went to the Episcopal Church after she married your dad, that her background was ARP.
Absolutely.
And I know, and you're very clear about the environment that you were brought in, where synonym cuss words like darn and gosh, you got your mouth washed out,
yep.
And no alcohol, no cards, da 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 da. That was very clear.
Well, my father was an alcoholic. My mother was a person who thought all alcohol was evil. It was an interesting kind of schizophrenia.
Well, here is the what I would identify as the third principle. First was traditional religious training. Idle mind is the devil's workshop. The third is spare the rod, spoil the child.
Absolutely.
And you were, I believe I'm correct, that spanking was something that was not totally unknown in your upbringing.
That's absolutely correct. My mother was a Calvinist who believed that all children were born evil, and it was her business and duty to make sure they were straightened out.
Well, what is your reaction to that principle? Spare the rod, spoil the child.
I would be opposed to that today. I don't think any child should ever be struck by any adult under any set of circumstances. When I was the bishop, we had a commission on children that studied various things, and they came out with a resolution that corporal punishment is never appropriate it could never be called appropriate behavior. And we put this report out, and it was debated in every newspaper in New Jersey, and the press was really so interested in this, they came and attended, and I think somebody gutted the report. I think this is right, Chris, you were on the committee.
Yeah.
I think somebody gutted the report by amending the resolution to remove the words corporal punishment and to say any kind of cruel and abusive punishment is never appropriate. Well, everybody could agree on that, so everybody said hooray. But there was a really enormous debate in the diocese before that change was made. And what I heard is maybe the most interesting thing over which I ever presided, because people were giving personal testimonies that you would think might be appropriate in the psychiatrist's chair. They were talking about, some would talk about, my father beat me to within an inch of my life, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. It made a man out of me, and that sort of stuff. And others would get up and they'd still be quivering and talking about how humiliated they had been. And it was a debate that you don't see often because it got so intensely personal. Mm-hmm. And I was really sorry that this resolution was introduced, which in effect gutted the report. I didn't believe when I was the bishop that if our report had been sustained, that all corporal punishment of all children across New Jersey would immediately cease. You know, I don't think the church has that kind of power. But it was a kind of consciousness-raising debate to at least cause people to look at that possibility and to see. I never used corporal punishment on my children, and I really do consider it inappropriate.
Bishop Spong, I almost feel trepidatious doing this because you are so much more learned than I am in things biblical.
I'm always worried when somebody starts out. It's like Sam Irwin. I'm just a country lawyer.
Good old North Carolina boy.
Yeah.
But you know, one thing that's fundamental to so much of what you have done, ever since you read Honest to God and Paul Tillich's book, Courage to Be, and all these profound things that have happened, is that a literal interpretation of the Bible is simply something that is invalid if you take it word for word, because you have to take it within the context of the time and circumstances under which it was written.
Yeah.
Now, Corporal, the fact that the Wisnets, interestingly enough, Pearl Wisnet would schedule what she called whipping night.
Yeah, I remember that.
She would have the kids come in, particularly sort of junior high school boys, 13, 14. She said, well, did you do this? Did you do this? Did you do this? Well, that's 5. She had a big old thing like a ping pong paddle. Pow, 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 pow. Now, do you think that we ought to be sensitive to the fact that that was a different time?
Of course.
And a different place, and therefore they have to be judged within the values of that era and not the values of today?
Both Abraham Lincoln and Harry Truman would be racist by our standards today, and yet Abraham Lincoln emancipated the black people, and Harry Truman opened the armed services to them, and there was a forward steps, and they looked very liberal in that time. But if you go back and read the attitudes, Lincoln wanted to repopulate Africa with American blacks, and he wouldn't have conceived of the idea of having a meal with a person of color. And Harry Truman was much the same way. Now, you can't judge people outside of their time in history. I mean, Abraham Lincoln made a great contribution. I think he's one of the 2 great presidents we've had in this country. I think Thomas Jefferson was the other, and I'm happy that one is in each party so that I can be balanced on that. But, and Harry Truman is my favorite president of the 20th century, and I think he had some terrifying decisions to make, and he made them with courage, and I don't think always with great understanding, but he always made them and they came out right. I mean, he had the atomic bomb, he had the NATO decision to make, he had the Greece and Turkey decision to make. Those were really crucial things in that period of history, and I think he made them all right. He was the kind of person that I believe his instincts were better than his intellect. I don't mean to say he wasn't a bright man, but he had never been to college, and that's kind of unusual for the President of the United States, but he was a voracious reader. But his instincts, he was the kind of person that if he was walking on a high wire and somebody came up behind him and said boo, he'd always fall off on the right side of the issue. And I think that's what you look for in that era. No, I don't think we should judge Red Wisnet and Mrs. Wisnet, I didn't remember her name, outside the context of their time. But I do think that if you're running a public institution and the lives of people are involved in your decisions, that it's important that you stay up with the best thinking in the time about the way to give the best care to these children. And I'm convinced that Red Wisnet and his wife both gave the best care they knew how to give. And the last thing I'd want to do is cast judgment upon but it would be very different from what I would want from any of my children. The kids at school used to talk about those discipline nights. That is my people I knew who were members of the Thompson Orphanage. And I just think that's pretty heavy. But, my mother was a sweet and loving woman. But, boy, she did not believe in sparing the rod. And she thought she was doing God's service when she did that. But you see, that's the way we've used the Bible. We justified slavery by quoting the Bible. We justified segregation by quoting the Bible. We justified the second-class status for women. We today justify the rejection of gay and lesbian people because it's clearly condemned in the Bible. I think that's baloney, but that's what is said. And one of the things I can bring to the table is that I've really read the Bible. I've studied it all my life, and I don't think anybody who reads it would ever want to literalize it. The Book of Deuteronomy calls for children who talk back to their parents and are willfully disobedient to be executed. Now, who quotes that today? I don't know anybody still be alive if we did that literally.
It's what you call the terrible text of the Bible.
That's exactly right. Harper changed my title, and so it came out The Sins of Scripture, but I wanted to name it The Terrible Text of the Bible.
I've seen your lecture on YouTube.
Have you?
You are an absolutely spellbinding lecturer.
I'm glad to hear that.
I mean, going back to those days at Canuga, which was just happenstance that
That's
you were
exactly right.
that you were the substitute teacher, and said, and you recognized what you could do, and I'm sure that, well, I mean, I could go on and on. I'm not trying, I mean, but I have two questions which aren't directly related, but I'm going to ask anyway because I'm interested, and then I'm going to.
We need to end because he's got to lecture tonight.
Okay. Well, let me just say, thank you for that.
You're welcome, but he is here to lecture.
I understand. Well, I won't ask you the questions. I want to thank you.
Go ahead, I can do another minute.
Okay. Does coming to Mecklenburg County evoke any emotion in you?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I really loved it. I loved being in Raleigh earlier this week, and I love being here at Davidson, and I'm going back to Raleigh to lecture tomorrow night at Meredith College.
My wife went to Meredith.
And yeah, I come to North Carolina a lot. In the summer, we go up to Highlands and Cashers, and where I've done lectures for about 10 years in the summer as part of their vacation program. But I love those mountains, and Chris and I climb a mountain a day up there, and it's the most relaxing week of our lives, and I really just love it. And I've got lots of friends. I never will forget doing some lectures in Hendersonville, and two girls that I had either dated or wanted to date when I was in high school were in the audience, and I didn't recognize either one of them. You know, that's a long time ago. And the first one came out, and she said, "I'm Catherine Sweat. Do you remember me?" Well, yeah, I remembered her well. She was an older woman. She was 16 when I was 15. And she was the first older woman I ever went out with. And she wore great big rose-colored glasses. And we used to make fun of her name. A name like Sweat is easy to play with when you're 16 years old. So we called her Percy for perspiration or something. But anyway, she came through this line. It was in a receiving line. Didn't have time to talk. She said, "I'm Catherine Sweat. Do you remember me?" And I said, "Of course I remember you." And she said, "I've become Jewish." And she walked on. That's the last word. I had no way to converse with her at all. And then in the same group, this woman came by who I'd been sort of in love with since I was in the 4th grade. She was the prettiest girl, and she was the star in high school. She was the head cheerleader, and she dated the football hero, and they got married, and she was named most beautiful and most likely to succeed. She was really the star. Her name was Harriet Whitmore. And she came by and she said, "I'm Harriet Whitmore, Crow, I think her present name is. Do you remember me?" And I said, "God, I was in love with you from the 4th grade on. How could I ever forget you?" And we've had such an incredible opportunity, and we've gotten to know each other. Chris and her husband Johnny and I have had dinner together a couple of times. It's just wonderful feeling to reminisce and pull that back. And we went to my 60th graduation anniversary from Central High School. And the only thing I was impressed with was that I was in better shape than most of the people that were there. I mean, that was really the halt, the lame, and the blind. We had people coming in on walkers and with hearing aids, and I don't think we had any seeing eye dogs, but we had amputees. And you know, I have a hard time thinking I'm that old, but Harriet was there, and so she was sort of the one other person that we had a wonderful time to converse with. And it's, you know, as I say, I was kind of a nerd in high school, and it's kind of wonderful to go back and to see some of these people and to see that the standards by which I judged success and failure when I was a high school kid aren't very important to.
See, you and I come out. See, I was born in 1937.
Okay, you're just.
But I grew up in the segregated South.
Yeah.
I, like you, are deeply affected by the fact that we were born in the South. We bring a perspective that a lot of people in this country cannot bring because we are Southerners. And
I call myself a recovering racist.
Well,
just like people are recovering alcoholics.
It's like a tick. It's like a tick. And you know, it's always there. But we have seen change.
It's been remarkable. It's been remarkable.
I thank you so much.
I think we need to
ask you one question.
Sure.
I was born 1931.
That's my age.
Same year. I came to Charlotte in '69 and worked with an Episcopal layman, Dr. Ed Hipp. Did you ever know Dr. Hipp?
He was my doctor, and just a wonderful human being. I just remember him as just everything good.
Well,
He
we
was-
took care of the Thompson Orphanage children.
I would not be
At
surprised.
that time,
Yeah.
because that was before Medicare.
He wound up
Medicaid.
being a surgeon, didn't he?